Today we have Callum, who's joining us to talk about cyber EMTs, emergency malware technicians. Welcome Callum, and take it away.
All right. Hello everyone. Welcome to Cyber EMTs, or better, how to be an effective SOC analyst in incident response. First, I'd like to thank BSides Canberra for having me here today, and for all of you for coming along. So who am I? I'm a senior SOC security analyst at Tesserent, working in the MSP SOC that provides a managed detection response service to a wide variety of customers. As part of this, I've had the great privilege, if you call it, to be involved in a number of incident response events. Previously, I was in the Army for 6 years before jumping over to reserves, where I predominantly support cyber operations. And they're just some of the qualifications I have. So what we'll be going over today, the title is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but pays homage to a real-world equivalent to our role. Put simply, as a SOC analyst, our place in the incident is the first responder. A lot of this presentation will be covering what should be understood and practiced by SOC analysts before an incident, and to do so, I'll cover what we need to understand about ourselves, the adversaries, and the tools available to us. Then we'll go over some skills and techniques I practice and find extremely useful when involved in incident response. So I've aimed this talk at newcomers and experienced analysts alike, seeking to impart the fundamental skills required to be an effective SOC analyst in and around incident response. All right, so some context before we dive in. As I just alluded to, as SOC analysts, we're the first responders to an incident. We're the first ones to find something that is wrong, and as such, we're best positioned to assess the initial impact and stabilise the situation before incident responders fully assess the event and move to eradication and recovery. We need to rapidly triage the event and understand the extent of it to better support the dedicated IR team. And we achieve that best by our knowledge of the environment to identify what is normal, what warrants further investigation, and potential targets and high-value information. All right, so we'll start off with the understanding phase. While we're far from being in a war, the defensive-offensive nature of cybersecurity still aligns with this lesson from Sun Tzu. We need to know what we're protecting, the most likely attacks, and the tools we have available to protect ourselves. The understanding phase is easily where we spend the most time by a long mile. Gaining awareness of the environments we're protecting is not a process completed overnight. And depending on the complexity of your environments, this is a large undertaking, but well worth it for not only IR, but day-to-day operations as well. So as Sun Tzu says, we need to know ourselves and the enemy. Let's start with ourselves. Understanding ourselves underpins all three areas we contribute to as first responders to an IR investigation. Knowing what is normal warrants further investigation and potential targets. This phase of understanding is really just asking a lot of questions, with each answer bringing us closer to understanding the environments we're dealing with. Broadly speaking, we can segment what we're defending by 4 groups: networks, endpoints, users, and administration. Within each of these groups, we should ask and answer the following to complete our perception and understanding of the environment. In the interest of time, I've kept the descriptions to a high level. These initial questions posed will cascade into more granular questions based on your environments. So starting with networks, we need to understand the composition. Is the network small and flat, or does it span multiple locations? Is it on-premise, cloud, or a hybrid of both? How do the different environments connect to each other if they exist, and are they segmented? And what devices and technology enable the above network functionality? Additionally, we should look at how users connect. Are they via VPN, or are they in specific offices? Do they use MFA or single factor, for example? So after networks, we need to know what devices our environments consists of, their purpose, and how they're used, configured, controlled, and protected. So when we're identifying our endpoints, we shouldn't just consider laptops and servers and desktop PCs. We should also consider our equipment, operational technology, and Internet of Things devices if applicable. We should look at how user devices are managed. Is it managed by the organisation, or do they bring in their own devices? And how many do each user have? Additionally, we should prioritise the assets we have and understand what is vital to the business and security of the organisation. Within that, we should also account for the operating systems and software in our environment. We should understand what purpose they're serving and how their logs are presented to us. We should start to recognise typical system events in logs so we can start to filter out known benign events. Knowing what equipment, software and operating systems are present is essential to know, especially when wide-reaching vulnerabilities in software and devices are discovered. For example, the myriad issues with the sharing software and network edge devices we've seen in the last couple of years. So moving on to users. So we need to understand the types of users we have in our environment. Are they typical Office Suite and business line application users? Or do we have power users such as developers who have what I call varied and unpredictable actions? Within that, we should also identify who our executive staff are. While they typically have a standard user access, they can often have an increased influence to alter processes, making them prime targets for threats like business email compromise. We should also understand the user mobility, as in where do they sign in from? Do they work from home or do they work from multiple offices? Are they expected to travel, and are there any access restrictions in place? And finally, how are the users' activities controlled? Is it through acceptable use policies, as in we just tell them, pretty please don't do this? Or is it enforced through things like Intune or group policy? Answering these questions helps establish what typical user behaviour looks like, aiding in identifying true and false positives. So moving on to administration. Knowing how an environment is administered is crucial for us as first responders. Admin processes are often abused by threat actors, and the level of access admins have to an environment requires fast response when suspicious activity around them occurs. So we should look at what their tools and processes are. Are they commercial tools, or is it just a bunch of scripts they've hobbled together themselves? Where are these tools stored and who has access? We should also look at how admin accounts are managed. Are they separate from their day-to-day accounts? And if so, are they named admin accounts, as in one per admin, or do they just have one that they share that everyone uses? And related to this are service accounts. These are accounts that enable automation, like automated logons to specific services. So often they'll have very specific but highly privileged permissions. So we should understand what their usage patterns are and where they're expected to connect to, so we can start to identify deviations from that expected behaviour. So we also should understand the organisation. So it's crucial to understand our place in the world. So we need to know what industry we operate in, what products and services we offer, what are the goals of the organisation, who are our peers or competitors, and what countries do we operate in. These insights help identify the functions we support, typical third-party interactions, and potential exploitation points. Understanding the industry context allows us to spot trends that could impact us and adapt defences. Finally, we've got all the questions, but where do we get the answers? So we can look at documentation like SOPs, network maps, policies, etc. But it's often better to just talk to the admins, network engineers, etc. to understand how they work and administer the system. This is especially useful in establishing these relationships early, because these are the people you need to talk to during an incident response. So having that relationship already there is essential. So next we need to know how these known events appear in logs, or if we can see them at all. Finally, we need to document all of these insights in a shared knowledge base. This helps the entire team to distinguish the false from true positives during investigations. However, we should regularly review this information to keep it accurate and relevant, as environments change over time, and working from old information can be more detrimental than no information at all. All right, so we know ourselves now. How do we find out about the adversaries? So most cannot defend against every threat actor, so we need to prioritise based on what types are likely to target us. So we started looking at the highest level, at the threat actor types. I usually like to look at cyber criminals and insiders regardless of the industry and that sort of thing we're in, as these often, like cyber criminals often target indiscriminately, often focusing on exploiting the latest, greatest vulnerability. While insider threats can be the result of simple mistakes, inadvertently being manipulated, or maliciousness. To further consolidate this list, we should consider the goals of these threat actor types and how they relate to us as a company, industry, and country. From here, we can prioritise that list based on most to least likely to target us. So next is understanding how they achieve their goals against us. While threat actor techniques vary, the overall attack blueprint remains fairly consistent. Typically, adversaries aim to gain access, move within the environment, gather sensitive information, establish persistence, escalate privileges, and then achieve their end goals. Not all attacks will follow this exact blueprint. However, it serves as a good initial guideline of how to think about how attackers will try and move through your network. So finally, in the understanding, we need to understand our tools. So we need to consider which logs are being ingested and what events we can and can't see within our network endpoints, cloud, for example. We should also understand what security tools we have that are preventative measures and what they can and cannot do. Identifying these gaps early allows us to streamline investigations and prompt fixes where needed. Again, this should be documented and regularly reviewed. All right, so now we'll move into some skills that are critical in incident response. So starting with creative thinking. To identify potential scenarios that we're seeing in logs, we need to think outside the box. Using our knowledge of the environment, potential threats, available tools, and the suspicious event we've identified, we can start to form hypotheses about its cause. Essentially, we come up with a narrative that describes the events we are seeing based on our understanding of ourselves and the adversaries. A way to approach this is to think like an adversary. So we adopt the attacker's mindset. So when we see an event, we should consider, what would I aim for next? We can use frameworks like the attack matrix to anticipate adversaries' tactics and find ways they might achieve their goals. From here, with each of these hypotheses, we ask what events are benign, what events are malicious, and where we can find evidence to confirm or refute each hypothesis. Next is communication, collaboration. So we should never work in isolation. We should collaborate with our other security analysts, the IT team, network engineers, etc., to cover all aspects and promptly address questions. We should also understand our place in the incident response plan and what we need to do at each stage. We should also have a firm communication strategy, especially when an incident is identified. We need to establish a communication plan and adhere to it, even if there are no updates. We should also understand what channels we use for internal and external communications as appropriate. Finally, we need to communicate with empathy. Our role is to gather and present facts to a varying audience with varying technical knowledge. Everyone will be feeling stressed and looking for answers, so we should keep that in mind when communicating. All right, so the last section is just some techniques I use during incident response to try and make things a bit faster and a bit more efficient. So starting with MITRE ATT&CK as a map. So for those unaware, MITRE ATT&CK is a framework of the threat actors' TTPs, or tactics, techniques and procedures, presented a matrix structure. So tactics are listed across the top, left to right, in a loose order of progression in an intrusion. Techniques are listed underneath, and clicking on a technique within the matrix provides descriptions and procedures used by attackers that are seen in the wild. So not every attack involves all tactics and techniques. The tactics used depend on the attacker's specific goals and they may not follow a strict left to right progression. So how do we use this as a map? Say, for example, we found an alert, looks like a persistence event. If we look to the left of that, we can see that initial access and execution came before it. So when we're looking through the logs, we should be looking for events that line up with that. From there, we can look forward and anticipate things like privilege escalation, lateral movement, exfiltration and impact, for example. This is especially useful in dividing tasks among analysts. One can look forward while the other one looks back. Overall, it provides a structured map to guide the investigation and shape initial assumptions and hypotheses. So next is the structured analytic techniques. I've stolen this from CTI, but I feel like they can share. So the first one being the key assumptions check. Assumptions are great in that they can guide our initial analysis, especially based on previous experience, but we shouldn't hold on to these if they contradict evidence as they appear. So when you start an investigation, note down all the assumptions you're going into it with, and regularly review that to see if it still matches and if it needs to be thrown away, essentially. Next is the analysis of competing hypotheses. This is where we list all the theories we have of what the event could be, and as we go along and find evidence, we map that against each of these hypotheses as to say whether it supports, refutes, or has no bearing on. And as time goes on, as we continue this practice, the most likely explanation will start to emerge as it has the most evidence supporting it. A caveat to this is use this to structure your thinking and notes, but avoid overcomplicating the process. It's very easy to go into a rabbit hole with getting these formatted all nice and everything, but it's just a tool there to put like a left and right on your thinking process. So next is log analysis. This is something we do every day, but sometimes you'll find yourself using a tool you don't use very often during an incident, and that is the worst possible time to be trying to refresh yourself on how to use it. So we should regularly practice using all the tools that we have available to us and understanding how they present the logs to us, how to filter those logs effectively, especially for those benign events we've identified. Finally, you need to understand the data each log contains and the limitations of it. Some will only contain metadata about events, while others contain a lot of information. So learning how to find what you need to find within those is essential, especially ahead of time. So next is note-taking. Our investigation is incomplete if we can't collaborate and share our findings in an effective way. The best way to support this without losing too much time is good but simple note-taking in a shared resource. This can act as a single source of truth for tracking the event, and it should have accountability, immutability, and versioning. Essentially, we need to know how the notes have changed over time and who made those changes. When conducting an investigation, you usually want to have a timeline, communication plan, assumptions and hypotheses, and space for collected evidence for that investigation that each analyst is contributing to. This simplifies ongoing communication and document generation, especially for PIRs, post-incident reviews and after-action reviews. And finally, poise and rationality. Like first responders, we need to stay calm under pressure. Triaging the intrusion can be stressful. However, it's crucial to stay level-headed and maintain analytical rigour. The task may seem daunting, but applying the skills, knowledge and techniques provided can offer a clear roadmap of where are we now, what do we need to uncover next, and how can this intrusion be contained. So we should, like I've already touched on this, but we need to collaborate, work with other analysts and split up the tasks. Remember to take breaks. These are marathons, not sprints, to lean on that cliche. Make sure to step away when you can to recharge. And finally, make sure you review and improve. Conduct an after-action review with the entire team to identify successes, gaps and areas for improvements. And as the great Panic at the Disco said, it's much better to face these things with a sense of poise and rationality. All right, so just wrapping up, we covered a lot today in a very quick succession. We established the essential understanding, skills and techniques first responders to security incidents need. Understanding started with ourselves, namely our networks, endpoints, users and administration, before knowing our adversaries and their techniques. We capped that off with knowing how the tools available to us work. We covered essential skills in creative thinking, especially thinking like an adversary, as well as how we should communicate and collaborate internally and externally with empathy. Finally, we covered some techniques that are incredibly useful when conducting incident response investigations, like MITRE attack maps, structured analytic techniques, log analysis, and remaining calm under pressure. As my parting advice, one of the most important parts of being a first responder is to look after yourself and your teammates. This is a stressful but rewarding job. Work together and most importantly, have fun when you can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Callum. We've got some time for questions.
Oh, geez.
I'll start here and then.
Oh, hi, Callum. Great talk. So I was really interested to know whether you do structured debriefs after your incidents.
Yes, that's what I was touching on with the after action reviews and that sort of thing. I also try to include people that weren't in the investigation as well in that, because they come in with a completely fresh perspective and can see the forest from the trees sort of thing. So yeah, that's definitely something we try to do after everyone. So.
Can we pass that back?
Just on the topic of note-taking and sharing resources, what would your recommended way to have a clean, shared resource or application for taking notes as a team?
So yeah, I deliberately didn't talk about specific tools because every shop has their own tools they use. So, you know, if you've got Office, use OneNote. If you're stuck in something else, try and leverage what you've got, because getting new tools is often very difficult. So I sort of just wanted to give the purpose of it, and then to try and let everyone work out how they can fit what they've got into that kind of format.
How do you handle if your SOC is leveraged across multiple different clients? How do you handle your analysts having to know, have knowledge of each of those differing environments?
Yeah, so that's as an MSP, we definitely experience that. Sort of, as I said at the start, it's a very long, ongoing process, and that first phase isn't just for IR; it's for SOC operations in general. So we try and have analysts do a deep dive into clients, present that back to the other analysts, share that. We're not expecting each and every analyst to do the same level of research for every single client we have. It's a shared responsibility.
Okay, thank you.
So it seems like a very high stress job. What advice do you have for people trying to get into it? Like how managing stress under that situation where you're kind of under attack or managing an incident?
I think it's something you definitely learn over time. It's hard to practice it going in, but I think what I often do is I think of how I've handled stressful situations in the past, not necessarily in a SOC context, and sort of the techniques that you use to deal with stressful situations in general, and keep those front of mind when you start to go into these time pressure situations.
Thanks.
And we've got one more up the front.
Hi, so in relation to your communication back to other team members but also the end client, do you have any advice on how often you communicate with them and on every assumption that you find something new? How do you deal with that?
Usually, so we like to try and agree upon a schedule. If it's an external client, try to agree upon a schedule, and rather than pepper them with every little thing we find, we'll give them, say it's every 30 minutes or every hour, depending on what's agreed upon, we give them an update. And that's still the same if in that hour we haven't found any new information. We still go, still investigating. It's, same as what we had before.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Callum. Here's a gift from BSides Canberra
Oh, thank you so much.
for presenting.